Hello everybody, my name is Shafiq Aziz and I work with Harmony Movement. Today we are very honored to have Dr. Karla Dhungana-Sainju meeting with us and discussing some of your findings. There was a really interesting article that was published in OSSTF's Forum magazine on the perspectives of Ontario teachers with dealing with identity-based bullying. So we really thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. So Karla, there were so many interesting findings based on your research and the article that you published, and I know there's a lot of work that you do in this space thinking about the perspectives of teachers that are working to challenge and support their students in a broad range of identities with a broad range of issues and struggles that they might be dealing with on a daily basis. So I just have a question in terms of how that article came to fruition. What motivated you to conduct and focus your research on that question?
Great question. So I've been conducting research on bullying for a little over 10 years now. And prior research, I looked at bullying roles, so the role of a bully, a victim, a defender. I've done research looking at bullying discourse on Twitter and social media. But I really started to think of identity-based bullying in the last several years because we've seen it a lot more in the news. We know that it's been increasing. And as a result of that, I was wanting to understand that aspect of bullying more. And so several years ago, I applied for a research grant through the OSSTF. They had an emerging issues grant that was available, and I applied to initially look at teachers' experiences with race-based bullying. As a woman of color myself, as students who have experienced similar experiences. I also teach a course on bullying. This often came up in my courses a lot, so I was very curious to look at it from that perspective. And I like to account a bit of this to serendipity. There happened to be an international call looking at multiple forms of identity-based bullying. And they weren't just interested in race-based bullying. They wanted to look at a broader range of identity-based bullying. And so I put my hat in the ring and I said I'd love to represent Canada in this international study. And then I went back to OSSTF and I said, can we expand the scope of the study and not just look at race-based bullying, but look at a broader range. And so I ended up looking at 6 types of identity-based bullying. So I looked at race, ethnicity, religion, academic ability, weight, and sexual orientation and gender identity. And so that's how the study came about. And so again, I took the lead for Canada, and we did a Canada-based study looking at, in the end, we had about a little over 1,000 teachers who responded to our survey across Canada. And then as part of the international study, we had 13 countries participate. So we had close to 5,000 teachers in that sample.
Yeah, a really great sample size to use and some very interesting results that came out of that, which we'll get to in a minute. But
absolutely.
you know, you did define for us aspects of identity-based bullying and what you were looking at in your research. But how does it differ from just, let's say, simple bullying?
That's right. That's a great question. And so we've all heard of the term bullying. I think it's commonplace. It pains me to even think that it's commonplace for youth to experience it. Unfortunately, we know from statistics that it's unfortunately a thing that happens very common for Canadian youth, and it is a pressing societal issue as far as bullying is concerned. When we think of bullying, we typically tend to define it with 3 characteristics or constructs. We tend to consider a power imbalance, repetition, and an intent to harm. And perhaps the more common types of bullying you may have heard of would be things like verbal bullying or physical bullying, relational bullying, or cyberbullying. And all of these can happen for different reasons. The way that identity-based bullying differs, it's still bullying, but it's rooted in discrimination.
Right.
And so when we think about it from that perspective, identity-based bullying then is reflecting systematic inequities related to someone's culture, their religion, their ability, their appearance, right? It's an aspect of their identity. And I want to clarify that it could be an actual identity or it could be a perceived identity. And that is the reason why they're being targeted. So then now if we think of identity-based bullying, these would be things like racism and classism, ableism, transphobia, homophobia. These are the forms of identity-based bullying that we can start to think of.
Right, and you mentioned systemic inequality being a part of that picture. Now, of course, our students might not understand that broader perspective. So what do you think how does that relate in terms of the students' actions and the words that they use and the ways in which they target certain parts of identity to those broader systemic level issues?
That's right. And you know, when we think about identity-based bullying, I tend to think about it from the perspective of othering someone. right? I think about it from the perspective of belonging. And so we take these broad identities that somebody either has or perceived to have, and we systemically, and remember, when we think of identity-based bullying, we can also refer to it as bias or stigma or prejudice-based bullying. So we think about how bias works. It's these unconscious or conscious thoughts that we have that we make broad assumptions and speculations about somebody based on that identity that they have, right? So from a student's perspective, it would be like looking at someone, seeing an identity that they have and just saying, oh, I assume that, you know, they are X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to target them for that reason. And some of this can be conscious or unconscious. I want to point that out as well, right? But again, it is based on our prejudice and our biases that we have, and we're acting on those bias and prejudice.
So what's the distinguishing factor? Like, what would a teacher be able to pick up on? Because I feel like a lot of bullying is already based on targeting certain parts of our identity, especially when those students are, let's say, different from the majority of the rest of their classmates. How would a teacher distinguish or identify when it crosses that line, so to say?
And I think, you know, I don't think there's an easy answer for that, right? I think teachers, we have to give credit that they have a very hard role to play, and it's often hard to distinguish it. It can be subtle or it can be overt. And so if we take some examples, it could be like somebody, you know, making a racist comment, right? It may be obvious to the teacher or it may not be obvious to them. It could be somebody misgendering someone.
Right.
And, you know, knowing that somebody prefers to be referred to by certain pronouns, but you are choosing to misgender them. It could be somebody making a joke about someone's culture, and maybe to them they think it's a joke, but it is hurtful, it's discriminatory, and it's harmful to them.
Absolutely.
Right? So again, I want to make note that it might be hard for teachers to, you know, navigate through what is and isn't, but I'd like to think that we can get to that point where they'd be able to identify what that would be.
You know, and it's obviously happening at a very interesting time when students are trying to figure out their identities in the first place. And it's almost like as soon as that identity comes up, it's being made fun of right away.
Absolutely. And you know, to your point, I think that's why identity-based bullying is particularly detrimental. We have enough research that says that, you know, somebody who experiences bullying will have, you know, severe consequences, both in the short term and the long term. And it can impact their academic work, it can impact their social stature, it can impact their levels of self-confidence, there can be issues with mental health, there can even be physiological impacts on that individual. But when we think of identity-based bullying has to do with your sense of self, right? This is your own identity. These are things we cannot change. And so when you are targeted for that, we now know that the impacts are far more detrimental than just traditional forms of bullying, because this is something that is based on your sense of self. And so when we think about this, we also know that those who have multiple marginalized identities feel these impacts even more, right? So imagine you are a young teen who is going through the developmental stage of adolescence. When we're in adolescence, we're navigating puberty, we're navigating, you know, coming to terms with our sense of identity, be it our sexual orientation, our gender identity, even our faith, right? Even our abilities. And when somebody targets you for that, something that you yourself are trying to figure out, and somebody is making fun of you for that or making you feel like you don't belong because of that identity, that hits much harder than if somebody would just call you, you know, use some generic forms of bullying for you.
Absolutely.
Right?
So that begs the question, what should teachers do about all of this?
So that's one of the things we're looking at in our research, right? And so what we went about in our study was we asked teachers, first we had 6 different types of identity-based bullying, and they were randomly assigned to a group, and they responded to a hypothetical vignette where they were put forth a vignette saying they were shown an example of religious-based bullying happening or ethnic-based bullying happening or race-based and so forth, and then they had to answer a series of questions. So we asked them, do you think, how serious is it to respond to this scenario? Do you think it is important to respond to this scenario? How likely are you to intervene in this scenario? And then we also asked them different things about, you know, whether they felt empathy for the victim, whether they had self-efficacy. And as it turns out, teachers tend to think that all forms of bullying are serious, or identity-based bullying are serious. All of them are important to respond to. but their likelihood of intervention changed based on the type of identity-based bullying.
Interesting. So which ones were more likely to be responded to?
Yeah, so what we found in our study was teachers were more likely to intervene in instances of race, ethnicity, and religious-based bullying.
Race, ethnicity, and religious-based bullying. Okay.
And they were least likely to respond to sexual orientation-based bullying.
Now, what do you make of that?
You know, that was one of the findings that stood out the most for us because it stood out for a couple of different reasons. For one, Canada likes to promote itself as an inclusive space. We really promote that we, believe in the values and the rights of LGBTQ plus population, and yet we have statistics and studies that show that youth who identify as LGBTQ youth feel least comfortable disclosing their sexual orientation and gender identity in the classroom, and they suffer from much more severe consequences as a result of this, including depression, anxiety, reduced performance in the classrooms. So for us, when we see that teachers feel least comfortable with this, I went back to the literature, and when we asked teachers about whether they feel comfortable addressing this very sensitive issue, teachers claim they don't feel competent and well knowledgeable about these topics. So to me, it says that they don't have the knowledge and the know-how to address these issues, and yet we know that by not addressing it, there are detrimental impacts to the youth who identify with this identity. So the takeaway for us was, as far as all the questions we asked, it turns out that teachers can think it's very serious to respond to or it's a very serious issue, or that it's important to respond to, but what mattered was their self-efficacy. In other words, they needed to feel competent enough that they could address the issue effectively, and that's what predicted their action in intervening.
Absolutely. Well, there's so many things that contribute to that, but specifically with supporting our 2S LGBTQ plus students, just goes the data goes to show you how important it is to have our GSAs and our rainbow clubs within our schools, right?
Yes, absolutely. And there is studies that show that this is where, when we look at policies, that's one of the areas where we have concrete research that suggests that schools that have policies related to LGBTQ plus rights and protections within their official policies will reduce the likelihood of these youth experiencing violence, feeling a greater sense of safety, feeling less segregated within these schools. So that policy is important, right? We need to have those policies in place. What we're essentially saying is that it has to go beyond these policies, that we have to arm the teachers with the right knowledge, skills, and tools to competently address these issues. We need to increase their self-efficacy.
Absolutely. One thing that I could say that I feel contributes to that is just normalizing that conversation, engaging with it regularly, and putting it into practice as often as may be needed.
Absolutely.
Now, I wanted to go back to the other statistic that you shared in terms of the fact that race, ethnicity, and religion were the ones that educators felt most confident or capable of addressing. What do you make of that data? And I have some other questions related to that, because there's a lot of those issues coming up within our schools nowadays.
Yeah, we didn't quite have information to unpack that as much as we would like to. I think we found similar findings in our international study as well. So in the international study, we found that teachers were more likely to respond to ethnicity-based bullying and least likely to respond to sexuality and sexual orientation-based bullying. So similar findings there. And the Canadian side, a bit of it I'd like to attribute to a bit more training on the teacher's end, where we are doing more multiculturalism training in the classrooms, at least on paper. That's what it seems like. They're offering more, I can't think of the term right now, AQ? For teachers, right? So they have AQ. So they have AQ courses for teachers that I've made an observation that has been increasing as far as the multiculturalism aspect of it. But within that push for multiculturalism, sexual orientation and gender identity are not being folded into that.
I see. They're not taking an intersectional approach to understand the broad range of identities that exist when we talk about culture.
That's right.
Everything is connected
That's
to
right. That's right. And you can't exist like somebody with one identity doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Often an individual has multiple intersectional identities, but we're failing to consider that.
When you look at that information or that data in one way, it could point to some potentially promising practices or some growth or levels of confidence. But then if you kind of switch your perspective, it could be a bit concerning. And what I mean by that is that if educators have indicated that their highest level of comfort and confidence in addressing identity-based bullying is with race and culture and religion, there's also the reality that those are still the highest, most frequent forms of slurs and hate speech and identity-based bullying that we've been noticing through our work as well.
Yeah.
So I wonder what you make of that type of that perspective. And for me, it goes to show that even if they might have a level of comfort, it doesn't necessarily directly translate to those issues kind of being reduced.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I just want to make a caveat that this is a self-report survey, right? That we put out to teachers. And as with any self-report survey, you want to take it with a grain of salt because there is a level of response bias that goes in. And so imagine you're asking a teacher and they clearly identified this as a race-based bullying or a religious-based bullying scenario. There might be some social desirability where they think, I ought to respond in this way. Right? And I ought to say that it is serious. And I ought to say that it is important to respond to.
Absolutely.
And that I will respond to it and I will intervene. So I'll point that out. And then the second part is we also asked them a series of open-ended questions. And we said, what do you think is missing or needed to address identity-based bullying? And as much as the teacher said, it's serious, it's important, I will respond to it, the most common response we got was teacher training.
Right, teacher training.
Right? So they asked for it.
Yep.
So while again, they're saying, yes, I'll respond to it, they're also coming out and saying, but I need more. And we need the tools and the resources. And more specifically, they said, give us the practical tools, right? Give us practical tools of how we can actually address this. Give us clear, direct strategies of how we're going to go about this. They asked for anti-racism training. They asked for anti-discriminatory training. They asked for requests like, and again, this was open-ended. We didn't give the teachers a priori options to pick from. We didn't feed them any responses. They told us in their own words. So it was very powerful to hear from over 1,000 teachers in their own words what they think they needed. So when they're coming out here telling us, hey, we need more resources and support, and quite a few of them also said, and by the way, we need the time to do this training. Because oftentimes they feel like they don't have the bandwidth to do this training, or they're not given the time off, they're not given the space to be able to do all of this. So they're coming out and saying we think it's important, we want to respond to it, but give us the tools to feel more confident to appropriately address this.
It seems like there's 1,000 things on any educator's plate, and I know even at our university's level that's a feeling that you share as well. One of the issues is often the fact that there isn't the time and resources committed to being able to make those training sessions happen, unfortunately. Even if we go in and have our conversations with educators, it's usually squeezed into a 45-minute little section. So, going back to the idea that educators were really asking for practical tools and specific strategies, are there any examples that you've seen in your research that might have lent itself to supporting educators and increasing their self-efficacy?
The good news about self-efficacy is that it can be increased, right? And so the programming that we've seen that tends to work for teachers is, again, things that are anchored in real-life examples, giving them more concrete tools as opposed to abstractness. Because, to your point, they don't have time to sit through a multi-hour training where we're doing a ton of training. It's let's get to the meat of it. Let's get to the point of it. What are real things, scenarios, strategies that they can take to the classroom and immediately begin to implement? So we asked the teachers a question about what are some barriers that are in the way of you having these kinds of discussions in the classrooms. And one of the things they mentioned was, I just don't have the knowledge. I don't have the resources and the know-how. Right? So to me, it begs the question of what are some just tangible tools that they can immediately take and start to implement while taking into consideration all the barriers that they have.
It seems using the scenarios and the vignettes would be one very good strategy to help support that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, also giving them just dialogue that they can use, right? Like what are some scripts or prompts that they can look through? And I know there's been a couple folks, my colleagues over at PrevNet, they have a couple of things where they've put out scripts in real time that you can talk through these issues. How do you talk about the concept of bias? How do you talk about the concept of power? How do you talk about the concept of these different types of identity-based bullying in tangible ways, but also in a way that gets through to adolescents and youth? Because again, we can do adult speak, but youth have their own speak, right?
They
And so we
definitely
need
do.
to come at it from their perspective and their level.
So there's so many different things that we could use as approaches. I feel like it's oftentimes I feel it's whether or not the commitment has been made. Has there been a conscious decision to actually engage in those practices and to work through some of those moments of feeling awkward or tense or I don't know what to say or
Yeah.
is this going to land incorrectly? So it seems that that's probably one of the most significant aspects of kind of getting us started on that journey in the first place.
Yeah, and that's a great point. You know, there's prior studies really show that when youth were asked about what role they want their teachers to play, unequivocally they say they want their teachers to play a role in addressing bullying. And in fact, teachers who make it clear that they don't stand or support bullying will see less bullying in their classroom, right? So teachers play this very crucial role. Students want and demand of their teachers to be present and, you know, to play an active role in it. But at the same time, a lot of students feel that, you know, there have been studies where they've said, yeah, like, but my teacher hardly intervenes, right? They hardly step up. And so there's also a bit of, you know, building credibility for the teacher, for the student to feel confident enough that, you know, if I take this to my teacher, they will address it. And not just address it, they will effectively address it, right? So again, it comes right back to that notion of self-efficacy.
I feel that students really have that desire as often as it comes up, you know, and in my own practice within the classroom, I've seen that, you know, they're looking for that support.
That's right.
Can somebody help me?
Yeah.
Like this is a tough moment.
Exactly.
That I'm struggling through. What happens when educators don't intervene?
Well, and I think, you know, it lends to a school climate where we're allowing these kind of behaviors to perpetuate. They know that there are no consequences or ramifications for engaging in this kind of behavior. It's kind of like a reward system, right? If you're rewarding negative behavior, then it'll continue to go on. But if you know that there are consequences for engaging in this type of behavior, then it will stop. But it's not just within the classroom. I'd argue that, you know, it permeates within the school climate and the school culture. So even within our study, we found that if the teachers are in a school environment where other teachers are likely to intervene, it increases their likelihood of intervening. If they're in a school environment where the school administrators are likely to intervene and take this seriously, then they will intervene, right? So it goes, you know, it's not necessarily just a top-down, it's a trickle-down approach where along the whole school climate, if you have a culture where people call it out and people address it and it's an all-in effort, then we can start to see more changes happen. Because if a teacher alone addresses it in the classroom, but the administrators or other teachers are not doing anything about it, it feels like they're in an uphill battle of some sort.
It absolutely
right?
does, and it sends the wrong message as well.
Yeah.
When you think about, for example, even this last year in the cell phone ban policy that's been put into place, right? There's been conversations where some educators and some of my colleagues have been like, are you going to do it? Or how are you going to take that up? And I have a bit of a strong opinion on this one. I think that cell phones should not be permitted into classrooms. I think they have a lot of detrimental effects. Obviously, anything tech could be used as a tool to learn, but you know, in terms of that policy, I found myself thinking that consistent application would be absolutely critical. Now going back away from cell phones towards intervening in terms of identity-based bullying, I find it hard to think about how high of a level of consistency we can get it where the overall school climate is one in which as a collective we are taking those same types of actions and approaches. Have you seen any successful examples, or are there any indicators of what would promote having more educators work together as a team as opposed to just maybe a handful or certain folks in particular positions?
Can't think of any off the top of my head.
It seems that there's a lot of the times it's like, you know, a few really gung-ho educators who have really thought about the importance of this, and a lot of the weight falls onto their shoulders. And so, you know, in the work that we're engaging in, one of the things that we're really trying to emphasize is, at the very least, commit to interrupting. And intervening consistently every time that happens, right? Even if it's just to simply stop that process from continuing to unfold. So maybe like, you know, small, easy, digestible steps as a way to be able to build up confidence could be one strategy.
Yeah, and I agree. And I mean, there's research that they did some observational studies with children in the playground, and they basically found that a majority of the time nobody intervened. But if somebody just even stepped up and intervened, it stopped within 10 seconds, right? So at the end, to your point, even small steps matter. So even if somebody just steps in and intervenes and they stop it, that's good. Now let's take it the next step. The more youth in the classroom see that their teacher disapproves of bullying, then it will reduce the likelihood of it in that classroom. Perhaps that teacher can encourage another teacher to intervene, and that. So culture is hard to change, and it's a slow change, right? We can't expect school climate and school culture to change overnight, but if it's a gradual effort and there are incremental efforts happening across the board, then we can start to see some tangible change. Otherwise, it feels like it's just a monumental effort, right? You can't put it on the shoulders of one person.
Right.
But again, if everybody just puts their hands up and say, I'm just one person, what can I do, right? So I think there's a multi-pronged approach that needs to happen here, but certainly small steps matters, as do big steps.
Absolutely. It seems like there's a bit of a rising tide, unfortunately, though, in the last few years. I know you also conduct research and spend some time thinking about, interactions on online spaces, not specific to like school-aged children, but more broadly. And from what I've observed, there's so many influences. I mean, it kind of goes without saying, right?
Yeah.
Like things that are discussed on social media and have a high level of frequency of showing up in multiple different types of algorithms do tend to make their way into the schools and into our classrooms. From my perspective, although I'm not basing this on any specific data, it seems that since we've returned from our pandemic and virtual learning and coming back into the classroom in person, I've noticed a spike since then. Has your research indicated anything along those bases, or what do you make of the online spaces and how they've influenced the conversations that are showing up within our schools?
Online spaces are tricky because it often blurs the line between reality and what's happening in cyberspaces, because there are certain unique factors to bullying and bullying discourse that happens in online spaces, and one of them is this idea of a disinhibition that is afforded by the anonymity of being online. So people tend to behave and act in ways online that they may not do in person.
Yes.
And that's because they're behind a screen or a tablet or a phone or whatever it may be, and there's no immediate reaction to the individual that they're targeting. So, what you may say online, if you were face to face with a person, you may not do, because you're either going to fear for them retaliating, or there's an immediate consequence or a reaction to it. But when we have that disinhibition effect, because the anonymity that it affords us allow us to engage in that behavior, it emboldens folks in a way, and it allows you to engage in behaviors that are slightly different from what you would do in person. Not to say that not everybody, feels that way, but for the most part. So now when you bring that into real life, or not that online is not real life, but in-person scenarios, right? Then it becomes harder, because I think it's hard for folks to separate the two, but I'd argue that they're somewhat separate, because again, like your online persona and your in-person persona might be different, but the events and things that happen online can be very detrimental to an in-person scenario. So there's a lot of, there's a lot that happens within those two spaces.
so much. And it's quite different, right? Even thinking about the fact of, we always talk about having students increase their capacity and understanding of building empathy and compassion and recognizing the impact of your words on other people. And of course, if you don't have that person in front of you, it's just a screen or just a username, you cannot build that understanding. Right? So I know there's so many moving parts, right? And it goes to show you that a lot of the strategies that are being used are making some impacts, and there definitely are improvements, right? But one of the aspects that I think is absolutely critical, and something that pretty much every single school board has in place or has been developing and putting into place, are policies to help address these issues. So what kind of role do these policies at a school board level or even provincially have to play within educators' capacity to be able to address identity-based bullying?
Yeah, and policy is important. It provides us a foundation, and it provides us a tangible place we can look at to say, okay, here are the things that we should and should not be doing. So they're very important to have. And in fact, when we look at bullying, and the literature in bullying in particular, we find that specific to the LGBTQ+ population, having policies in place matters. Schools that have no policies or generic policies tend to have far more bullying victimization happen towards that population versus schools that do have it in place. Creates a safer space for these youth. Less violence, less feelings of segregation, right? Less bullying happening. But I will argue that policy alone is not enough. So going back to our study, teachers felt that it was important to respond to and that these instances of identity-based bullying were serious. And likely these are being driven by the fact that there are policies or legislation in place that dictates that you need to respond to this. But that itself is not predictive of action. What we need to do is give them the competence, the skills, and the tools to increase their self-efficacy in addressing these issues. So you can have an anti-bullying program in place, but without the right tools and competence for the individuals who are expected to carry out these programs and policies, there will not be fidelity to the bullying program.
Right.
It reduces the fidelity of the program.
Right.
And so this is where, again, giving them the confidence to actually properly and effectively address it matters. So certainly have policies in place, but have the backup to really support those policies so that teachers can act on it appropriately.
And I feel like a lot of the influence when teachers do decide to act and intervene, it has to do with their understanding of the impact on the students' experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And earlier we spoke about what was the finding that stood out in the fact that teachers felt less comfortable responding to sexual orientation and gender identity. And I'd argue that perhaps that's something that, and in fact teachers do say they don't feel comfortable responding to it because they don't have a clear understanding of these issues. And so given the fact that these are the populations that they're serving, it then is important that they become more knowledgeable about these sensitive topics so that they can appropriately address it.
Right. I think so much of that relates to educators being able to understand and explore their own identities, right? I mean, as much as we are adults and we've gone through so many experiences and we do understand, a lot of aspects of our identity, I often find when I'm engaging in conversations with other educators or some of my own colleagues in a school context, when they say I don't know how to talk about this, it kind of surprises me.
Yeah.
But I think that that's my bias showing, right? Where like I've spent time thinking about maybe one aspect of my identity a lot more, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they have that same level of knowledge.
Sure, yeah, and I completely take that point. I'm a woman of color myself, and I'm a first-generation immigrant. So perhaps these identities and these experiences resonate to me more, and I can speak to them more. But I can also appreciate the fact that there are certain identities that I will never understand because I've never walked in those shoes. So to me, it also means that I don't have to have lived their experience to be able to empathize with their experience. And this is where having trainings around cultural competency for you to understand other individuals' identities and how you can, address that more effectively will matter, because you won't be able to identify with everybody's identities, but that doesn't mean that you're not able to understand and empathize with it.
Building on that empathy and compassion piece, in our work we've seen that really extending our understanding of equity and inclusion has pretty much always led to social and emotional learning foundations.
That's right.
Yeah. And that's something that I feel like, when we're extending our understanding, if we haven't had a certain lived experience, that usually forms as a good foundation to be able to then link one experience to another.
Yeah.
It kind of also goes to show you the importance of that collective approach where the whole school climate is working towards this piece. And I guess also it's not always under our control, but having diversity in our school staff.
Yeah, and diversity is important because representation is important. So for a student to see somebody who looks like them, who has similar identities as them, those go a long way, right? So again, this is where if teachers feel comfortable in the classroom speaking about these things, but again, those take a long time to change, and we may not have folks who are going to exactly replicate their students' population. That does not mean that the teacher cannot have the cultural competency or the empathy to understand different identities and walks of life.
Right. Once again, a lot of moving parts.
Lots of moving
to this
parts.
Conversation.
And lots of expectations of our teachers, but they are the foundation of our youth's upbringing and giving them the skills that they're going to need to succeed out in the world. And so this is why we need to arm them with the resources and the tools to effectively address things that are happening in their classroom, like identity-based bullying.
I mean, it's so significant when you think about the amount of time that our educators spend with these students, with our children, right? And, especially in the context of for example, households that don't have both parents and somebody that can stay at home and greet you when you come home after school, or let's say, for example, a single parent that's working late until 9 p.m. closing time and coming home. I've often noticed that the educators, especially at the elementary level, spend more time with the children than their own parents do for cutting out the sleeping
Sure,
hours
yeah,
on the weekends.
exactly. A significant portion of their days are spent in the classroom, which makes the classroom an ideal place to learn positive behavior, but simultaneously also behavior that perhaps we don't want to reinforce, right? So think about it, if you are not just somebody who is the bully or the target or victim, you could be a bystander and you're witnessing these kinds of behaviors happen. You're still learning from that behavior, right? So when you see somebody stand up, when you see somebody speak out against something, when you see somebody call out, harmful or discriminatory language, you're learning a bit of that, because those are formative years where you're in adolescence, you are sort of still, again, navigating through these things. And if you have positive role models who are showing you, hey, it's not good for us to, address somebody based on their identities. It's not funny to make a joke based on someone's culture, right? It's not funny for you to come dressed in for Halloween because that's someone's culture. Or you need to understand why pronouns are important, right? We don't misgender someone. All of these things are ways that we can model and reflect behavior that then they can take on in their daily lives.
And those are those ongoing lessons embedded into every practice, every conversation, right? It doesn't always have to come back to here's our culturally relevant book that we're introducing, or here's our day celebrating these group of people, right? It has to kind of be there all the time.
100% agree. And I appreciate and value us bringing culture in the classroom to talk about festivals and all kinds of celebrations, and those are wonderful, but that can't be it. Because if we stop there, then it's just performatory. It needs to permeate in the daily, classroom, in the daily happenings that are going on. And then if we start to embed it within the daily lives of the children and the teachers, then we can start to see that change.
Absolutely. Live and breathe it, right?
Yeah. Absolutely, exactly.
So getting back to your research specifically and looking at some of the data and the responses that you received, I'm curious, what was something that was really surprising for you?
Honestly, and we spoke about it earlier already, it disheartened me to see that teachers felt least comfortable responding to the sexual orientation and gender identity, because I don't know, I see Canada as just such an inclusive space where we really promote inclusion for everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And that just really struck me that they came out and said that. And I think it's particularly, it stood out to me particularly because I also know that that's such a core part of someone's identity and sense of self. And if teachers are not fully knowledgeable, aware of it, and just the harms that can come out of that. So that probably is one thing that really stood out to me.
Absolutely. Well, I know there's a lot of good work that's happening in so many of our schools, so hopefully that will be able to kind of spread in terms of an understanding of supporting those students and being able to integrate that, especially as an intersectional approach as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there's so many things that you've shared with us today, and they're so critical, they're so useful. I think you might have already said this, but I'm going to ask you, just as a way to kind of wrapping up our conversation today, if there was one most critical action that you think schools, boards, or educators could take to improve their self-efficacy, to improve the rates of responding to identity-based bullying, what would that be?
Got to train the teachers. To me, it comes down to training, and this is directly from the words of the teachers that we surveyed, right? Again, we asked them an open-ended question: what is missing, what is needed? And overwhelmingly for all of the forms of identity-based bullying, except for weight-based, and I'll come back to this, it's just a caveat there, all of them said they want training and resources. For weight-based, they said, or appearance or weight-based bullying, they said they want student training and support, still training. And then the second most reason, which was flipped for both of those categories, was then the other 5 said student-based training, and then the other one said teacher-based training. So one word that it came down to was training. They want training, they want supports, and they want resources. And not just, again, these abstract, hey, this is bad, don't do this. They want tangible skills and tools. They want practical strategies that they can take to the classroom and start to implement, right? They want time for these trainings. They want, again, training that's really gonna be of use to them and they can take to the classroom because they see it as important. Our teachers did not say that they didn't care for these issues. All of them vehemently said, it is serious, it is important, we need to address it. What they're saying is, we don't quite know how to address it.
Absolutely. Well, Karla, I wanted to thank you so much for your time and sharing some of your wisdom with us. There's so many critical pieces there that I think are essential for us to be able to continue to push in the right direction. So thank you.
Of course, it
Thank
was my
you.
pleasure. Thanks so
Yes.
much.
And for those of us who joined us today and were listening in on our conversation, we will be sharing Karla's research and some links to some of her other articles that she's been publishing over the last few years. A lot of really interesting anecdotes there. We, of course, also will have a connection to our resources from Harmony Movement and specifically our Words Matter campaign, sharing some of those strategies and aspects of training that we discussed in our conversations today. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Thanks, Karla.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.